He had everything. The looks, he had the talent.
He had the rhythm,
he had
the soul.
He had everything. To me, he had everything.
What did you think when you saw it? You said, like, it changed your life when you saw that.
At 7, I don't know how much of a life I had to change, but whatever I had, it struck me right away, and I ran down. I got my mother to run down to the store the next week, and we rented a guitar.
When I first saw Elvis with a guitar, I thought, well, nice, that looks cool. And of course, I didn't understand it, but he had a guitar with a leather case, tooled leather case on it. And I thought that was the guitar. So, wow, this is a cool looking thing.
When really young, you're influenced so much by it. And I saw Love Me Tender, his first film, and we were all so excited. We were sitting there, I think me and John, a couple of the guys, sitting there waiting for Elvis, but it was kind of like it was a film.
It's a story.
And you first saw him, he was in a field with a plough and a horse. And you go, yes, that's him. And then it kind of cut in on him, hey, wow, the cinema went wild. And then, but there's no singing, and he's talking and all that. We're going, okay, that's good, but... And then he suddenly, they're talking about the house leaking and stuff, and he grabs the guitar. Well, there's a leak in this old building. Yes, there's a leak in this old building.
Right.
And then there's a hole in the roof where the rain pours in.
And then I heard Elvis. And, I was about 9 or something like that, and this voice came across in amongst Pat Boone and Johnny Mathis and all the stuff that was part of the Valium that we still know about today. Elvis came straight through, and he had the Blue Note. He was listening to Sleepy John Estes. He was listening to guy did That's All Right, Mama. Thank you, yeah. I get like that now. And he got all this stuff, Mystery Train, Junior Parker's Blue Flames. I didn't know anything about the references. I didn't know anything about what I know now, where it came from, but I heard that voice.
Well, Elvis was like, before the Beatles, my picture of Elvis was the American dream. I mean, this was a kid from the South who had broken all the rules, had become his own man and sort of looked like he did, whatever he wanted, whether adults liked it or not. That was kind of the picture I had. And
hello and welcome to this video. This video is, as you have seen, called Elvis is the King of Rock and Roll. Now, I have put that up as a statement of my opinion about Elvis Presley, who I'm not a huge fan of. I'm not one of these people who worships Elvis Presley, but it's undeniably the case that when I was growing up in the 70s, if you were to say Elvis Presley is the king of rock and roll, that would have been accepted. Everyone knew what you were talking about. But it seems now that if I make any reference to Elvis Presley on my channel, it motivates a whole bunch of pushback on here. And recently, I did this sort of 10 greatest albums of the last 100 years. And I, for the 1950s, put Elvis Presley's first album up. Now, I wasn't thinking politically or ideologically when I did that. That's based upon an experience I've had personally. I live in the Midlands in the United Kingdom. This is a sort of heartland of rock music, of British rock music. The bands that have come out of this area would be Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, ELO, Diamond Head. You've also had bands like UB40, Duran Duran. They've all come out from around this area. And I've had either direct contact with some of these bands or contact with people that were around those bands when they were first forming, especially your 1960s bands, the ones who created rock music. And so I grew up talking to these people in great depth. And what became quite apparent to me was here in the UK, when Elvis Presley emerged, right, it had such a profound effect on the people here that it really motivated a whole bunch of musicians to pick up a guitar. Now, the interviews I put at the beginning of this video attest to that, and I put some American musicians up, and I put up some contemporaries like B.B. King, who was actually around before Elvis, to also say, no, this guy is the guy. That is something that goes without question to me. But I think there's a little bit of ideology promoting this pushback against Elvis Presley. So what I'm going to do, rather than criticise it, is I'm going to steelman it as best as I can on this video, and then we'll see how much it makes sense. I think that's the best way to go, because on this video, I'm going to be questioning, is Elvis the king of rock and roll, and why would we say that? So, the popular music throughout the world, okay, wherever you go, but mainly in the sort of European, Western European countries, America, Canada, all of that, is based upon the popular music that emerged in America at the beginning of the 20th century. This music is an amalgamation of all the sort of folk music forms that existed in America at that time. America was a melting pot at that time, so there'd been a lot of fusions going on between different styles. So at the beginning of the 20th century, when recording started, there was so much interesting stuff going on, unlike the folk music that existed in Europe or Africa or Asia that had been around for millennia. This is stuff no one had really heard before. So all your popular music styles go back to basically American folk styles. Now, the argument here that we start off with is those folk styles, many of them are black music styles. So we have jazz would be a black music style, the blues would be a black music style. You would have also had a very strong black influence on country music and various other forms of music. And so this gives a voice to black people, and it's an area, because of the horrendous racism that exists in the Americas, where despite the sort of legacy of the slave trade, black geniuses are able to express themselves within their own terms, within their own music. And so you get these incredible music forms emerge, which are black originated. By the time we get to the 1950s, you've got blues, you've got urban blues and sort of Delta country blues, you've got jazz, swing jazz, you've got like rhythm and blues, soul, gospel music. Within this history, because all these music forms have been created by black people, what happens is that the capitalist sort of companies who want to make some money look at the genius works of these black people and go, we need to do that, but we need to whiteify it, and we need to take out some of the soul and present it so white people can like it. And that happened throughout the history of jazz, you know. So for every Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton, Fletcher Henderson, you also have your Artie Shaws, your Benny Goodmans, and your Glenn Millers. And these people are playing the music form, but it's a white version of the music form, and it's sort of diluted, but more it attests to the fact that this racism is going on the whole time. And these are the ones that made all the money, and then the black musicians were left behind, which is evidence of the horrendous racism that exists in America. By the time we get to the 1950s, you have brilliant musicians like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Fats Domino, Ike Turner, Chuck Berry, who are bringing together into sort of the black rhythm and blues sound and elements primarily from country music. Sam Phillips, who sets up a record label in the 1950s, wants to get this black music out to a white audience, and so he starts looking around for someone who can represent that. After recording all the, you know, classic rhythm and blues artists of the early 1950s, he then discovers this guy that's sort of coming in and walking around, who just happens to be a really good looking bloke called Elvis Presley. And although Elvis Presley isn't an enormous talent like a Chuck Berry or a Little Richard, he's far more palatable to a white and American audience. Sam Phillips records him. He records tunes that are written by, you know, Big Arthur Crudup, That's All Right Mama. You've got like, you know, You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, that Big Mama Thornton, you know. And it's like, it's so obvious if you go back to Hound Dog, those lyrics are written from a female's point of view. It doesn't even make sense when Elvis Presley sings them, you know. He's had to change the lyrics. It's like, you know, women aren't hound dogs, that's, you know, it's men that treat women badly and all this type of thing. It doesn't make sense, does it? So Elvis Presley is just there, and they put a big push behind him. He appears on television. It's more palatable to a white audience. He then becomes massively famous. And then on top of that, once he gets there, even though there was some semblance of proper black music in what he does, you know, Hollywood comes along and very quickly tames him, and before you know it, he's out there singing "Love Me Tender," which is a toxic white Civil War tune. All right. Elvis Presley then carries on. He ends up in Las Vegas. You know, he believes his own hype, and he dies young, and he's a travesty of what he represented. But the sort of racist white Americans see him as the king, and he's promoted as the king. My God, my phone's going off every 2 seconds. What the hell is going on? So that is the pushback. And so if we simplify that as an argument, what we've got is this idea that Elvis Presley represents sort of white capitalist racism in action and shows how black musicians have been pushed down. Okay? Right, so I'm now going to go through that bit by bit and give you my opinion on it. Okay? So all these folk forms that emerge in America, right, they are created because of the mixing that's going on. And the mixing that's going on, some of it is really organic, but some of it's not. Some of it is tainted by the toxicity of these separatist ideas that emerge in America. The argument for why, you know, black people should be slaves. And so it creates like a really strange pressure cooker. And I believe, and I've explained it elsewhere, and I would be here for an hour to explain why I think this is, but I think, to put it simply, that pressure cooker of black people and white people not being able to mix, but certain people crossing the tracks both ways, certain very creative individuals that switched onto something. It's like an osmosis. And so, you know, most people don't want anything to do with it, but certain people, like genius people, they look and they go, I want that, and they cross the tracks. And that's going on all the way through history. And so I cannot disentangle the input of black musicians and the input of white musicians. Now, when you take something like the blues is much more an Afro-American folk form that emerges out of slavery and is an expression of slavery. And so I would say there's a strong argument that the blues is a product of Americans who happen to be black, right? And it's based upon their experience. Although there is some influence of there, because obviously the blues is taking on folk forms, European songs and all that type of thing. But with jazz, and jazz is what creates the rhythm section, you know, jazz is what organised the sound onto record. You have drums, bass, piano, guitar, groove, all these things, improvisation, all that type of thing. So that when you look at a 1950s rock and roll band like Bill Haley in the comments, what you're looking up is a jump up jive rhythm and blues band like Louis Jordan. That's the lineup. The history of jazz is much more opaque, and I think it's much easier to say it's a product of integration, and all the people of America were involved in creating it. But then I have an ethical, moral view of this as well that then comes in on top of that, in that I think it would be much more pragmatically useful from an ethical point of view to say that all this music's American music and it's the product of people working together despite what was going on. Now, I understand that within sort of black political thought, there is separatist ideas where people want to separate these apart. And this is the big discussion here. Which side do you come on? Do you think the races should be separated and we should have black music and we should have white music? And do you think that blacks should have their own spaces and all that? And, you know, that is going on within the ideological left? Well, I don't. That's my opinion. I'm quite happy to argue against someone, but I don't think that. I think that I love music because of the fact it does go across racial, national, all these different divides. So what's really interesting about rock and roll is that we would not have rock music and we would not have the landscape of pop music if the genius of American folk music hadn't travelled to the UK. The UK, towards the latter part of the 1950s and the 1960s, plays a huge part. The Beatles, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, the Who, all these bands are so iconic and important that when you go to the late 60s and try and look at the American rock bands, they are not able to compete, and that's something that you have to take on board. Now, wouldn't it have been wonderful if all these British musicians, right, had been able to hear Big Arthur Crudup or Big Mama Thornton, you know, or Chuck Berry or any of these, but they never were going to because of racism. So Elvis Presley was the vehicle that transmitted these ideas to a whole bunch of people. And you can see that, especially here in the UK, that Elvis crossed over. So the question really comes in is, was Elvis Presley, like what they're saying, which is the second half of their pushback, was he just a sort of limp, white version of this music? Well, I think this is quite complex. But let's have a go. Elvis Presley, as has been documented, grew up in a multi-racial situation, albeit with a ton of racism, but he seemed to be quite open to mixing with black people, Mexican people, Spanish people, all sorts of different people. And so by the time he gets to 10 years old in 1945, he is able to assimilate right up close all the country music and the rhythm and blues influences that are around him. And that's why Sun Records happens to be where he is, because that is right in the middle of this thing that's going on. And so when Elvis Presley walks into Sun Records to record That's All Right Mama in 1954, he chooses a tune by Arthur Crudup, which is an out-and-out dirty blues, right? And he sings it. Now, does he sing it like Arthur Crudup? No. The reason is because he's also got a whole ton of country music influences there. And he was very religious, so there's a religious aspect in there as well. And so Elvis Presley is as much as a crooner in the tradition of Frank Sinatra or Bing Crosby, which again grew out of singers like, I don't know, Louis Armstrong. He's as much a mixture of that, and he's also got, a bit of Hank Williams in there, but he's also got all these other people. Now, I would love to say, he's up there with Chuck Berry and Little Richard, but of course, in 1954, to record that in 1954 in Sun Records, he's ahead of the pack. He is in that first wave of rock and roll musicians that are basically laying down the law, right? And the other thing with Elvis Presley is around that area had assimilated a band that was absolutely incredible. Bill Black was it on bass, I think, Scotty Moore on guitar, DJ Fontana on drums, and then later on the Jordanaires coming in. And these are incredible instrumentalists. And one of the things that's interesting with Elvis Presley is in those early records, rather than going for that big sort of saxophone-based upbeat, jump up jive blues band approach, there's a lot from country music, not just the sound and the songwriting, but also the arrangement gets pulled down. So a lot of these records don't have a drummer on. And when DJ Fontana comes in, who had before that had been part of a radio show, doing country music, this we really are seeing in 1954 the elements coalescing for the first time. Of course, Chuck Berry's done Maybelline at the same time, and he's in there as well. But the thing with Chuck Berry is, Chuck Berry didn't have the looks. And this is the other thing we have to take into account. And this is really something I think we have to take on. It wasn't that Elvis Presley was white. If you saw Elvis Presley in 1955, if you met him in the street walking down, you wouldn't have gone, oh my God, it's a white bloke. What you would have gone is, oh my God, that's a film star. This is one of the most... I mean, if we look at the history of rock and roll and rock music, and we look at the superstars, who is more beautiful than Elvis Presley? Who? He's the beginning and the end of this. He can dance and move like nobody else, and he is sexually provocative. Right? Now, we could argue that Little Richard is sexually provocative, but I actually believe that Little Richard was able to get a purchase, in 1956 commercially in the world of rock and roll, because he actually represented a gay black man, and the terror of a Muddy Waters or a Howling Wolf, which would not have been accepted by the racist white elements of society then, were appeased by someone like Little Richard. But Elvis Presley brings in that danger of a Muddy Waters. He brings in that to it. He's also brings in sort of film star looks. He's somewhere between Howlin' Wolf and Tony Curtis. And so I believe there's a magical set of elements with Elvis Presley. And to bring him down to a simple, this is a white guy playing black music, really is so unnuanced that it doesn't explain why this had an effect on so many people around the world. Right? Now, I would agree that, you know, the record companies got behind this and he became a sort of national, you know, phenomenon. Appears on was it the Ed Sullivan Show, you know, they went, oh my God, look at the way he's moving and dancing. And it actually is very provocative. We become used to it now because Elvis Presley has become the epitome of a rock star. So it's very hard to not throw the baby out with the bathwater with this, because I don't know whether rock and roll would have even had the success it had if it wasn't for Elvis Presley. And so we come down to a sort of a position where you're going to come on one side or the other. And I'm reminded of the philosopher Hume with his shoulds and oughts. Perhaps the world should have not been racist at that time. Perhaps the superstar that came through should have been a black person. Perhaps it shouldn't have been Elvis Presley. Perhaps and shoulds and shoulds and shoulds. But the world's not like that, is it? Okay? And the world is what it is. And if we're going to say we're a fan of this music form, if we're going to say we're a fan of Beatles, or we're a fan of Led Zeppelin, or we're a fan of The Who, as you have seen in my introductory interviews, there would have been none of those bands if it wasn't for Elvis Presley. And the thing is, Elvis Presley was the door for those musicians to step in and then go right back to the Robert Johnsons and Charlie Pattons, and right back to the whole history of American music. So he did spread it across the world, and you either accept that for what it is, right? Or you go, it shouldn't be like that. And of course, that is the position of the ideological left, is to throw that out and go, shouldn't it be like this? Yeah, of course it shouldn't be like it, but it is. It is. And you either deal with what is because you can't deal with what should be. Right? So, in my comings and goings in the music industry, one of the things that's also become apparent is so many musicians were inspired by Scotty Moore. And DJ Fontana's approach was far less about virtuosity than it was about groove and putting on a show. These musicians were highly influential in terms of informing how the next generation were going to approach rock and roll. As the 60s went on, of course, Elvis Presley was taken up by Hollywood. And his power was taken away from him and became quite soppy. So it's easy to forget how hard-hitting a lot of those early recordings are. But the thing about Elvis Presley, I think that's quite incredible, is he sets up the idea of the superstar. I cannot think of anyone that has the credentials of Elvis Presley. He's in there right from the beginning. He is playing serious rhythm and blues with rockabilly elements in, with rhythm and blues elements in, with country blues. But he looks like a film star. And for many musicians, I think, coming up after Elvis Presley, he inspired them to pick up a guitar, but he also set something that was unattainable. And in that respect, I think the tag of king, you know, that sort of thing that's been put on, I think it is the case. I think he is a king, and it's not because he's the most important rock and roller, but it's because he had the whole package, which I don't think anybody else had. And yes, part of that package was being white, and without the whiteness of Elvis Presley, you would not been able to have this music spread out and reach so many people. When the Beatles come along, the Beatles are informed by Elvis Presley, but they have a different genius aspect to them, is that they are very approachable and they make young people think that they can get up and play. Now, if you go to the interview that's at the beginning of this with Paul McCartney, what's interesting when you watch that is he actually sings. And when I watch Paul McCartney singing that Elvis Presley song from that film, check out the way he says the word leak, and the way he places the K, and the timing, and the way he goes leak. He has assimilated American rhythm and blues so deeply that I can feel the groove coming off him. The way he's moving, the actions, the way he is keeping time on the offbeat, the way he is singing the bass line, like almost like Louis Armstrong, you know, embodying a question and answer in his being. His Paul McCartney's fundamental talent is to be able to transmit. He could do it because he got it from Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley could do it because he got it from a whole bunch of different artists, both white country artists and black rhythm and blues artists. And it's that feeling that transmits. It's that we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on the way that music reaches out between peoples and brings them together, and how great music is the product of different cultures coming together and creating something new, not trying to argue for some insane separatist idea of the way the world should be run. Because this argument and this pushback that I'm getting from people online when I mentioned Elvis Presley, I don't think it's actually about race. I think it's about whether we should all be together and all be getting on and having a culture, you know, which is basically American culture or British culture, and everybody assimilates around that, or whether we should all separate ourselves off and all the black people should have their own music and they should have their own spaces, you know, their safe spaces, and they should have their own banks and their own this and their own that, whatever. And that is the tussle that's really going on. Now, I'm afraid to say what justified slavery was that type of thinking. And you're welcome to it if you want to think like that, but don't start shouting at me as though I'm absolutely the worst right-wing racist because I think we should go through the path where we look at our, you know, similarities and not our differences. I just don't believe there's that much difference. Right? I don't adhere to culture that much. I don't enshrine culture in such a thing. What I do is I try and look at culture and go, what's good about this culture and what are we going to take from it and learn from it? But the culture has to be able to bend. But what it can't bend is to intolerance. It can't bend to separatism. It can't bend to racism or prejudice. Those are my fundamental ethical values, and where I see it, I'll call it out. Now, if you think that you agree with that but you don't agree with me, then this is where the argument will be. But you can't just sit there and go, you know nothing, you're ignorant, which is what I've been getting. Now, what would the pushback be against me? Well, I think what would happen is people would say, you don't understand, Andy, this tussle that's gone on has happened because black people have been able to balance the racism against them. So you may say that this is all okay, we should all get on, but you don't understand the actual systemic racism that exists in Western culture. Well, I don't accept there is a thing called systemic racism. I don't know how a system can be racist unless it's written into the rules or laws of that system. If you find one of those laws, get rid of it. So I can't, you'd have to argue that. It doesn't make sense to me. I can't believe in some sort of racist spirit that roams around white organisations and just makes it, you know, no, it's the people in it that are racist, and people will always be racist, black and white. But then they would argue, you don't understand, in Western European culture and American culture, you have the white supremacy. Well, yeah, you know why? Because these countries are predominantly white, that's why. Here is the most contentious part of this video that I'm going to say now. I wasn't going to say it before, I've had to reshoot this ending because it didn't work, and I thought, nah, don't say it, but now I'm going to say it. King Sunny Ade is one of the great African musicians of the 20th century, an absolute giant of African music. Now, his music is an assimilation of African styles with Western European pop music, right? So he's got a whole ton of Western European pop music, but the reason why it's him that takes that on board, along with a whole bunch of African musicians, is because they take that music to the African people. I would never expect there to be a white person in Africa representing Western European popular music being infiltrated into there. Now, here in the UK, that's exactly the same thing. Especially in the 1950s, of course, we had Windrush people coming in. They were bringing in all their ska and all that stuff, brilliant stuff. But by the same token, this country is still predominantly a white country, and so it makes sense that the vehicle from America to bring rock and roll to us would be Elvis Presley. But it's the same thing in your country, but your country in America, if you are America, is blighted by this stain. That's the problem. It's blighted by this stain, and how do you get over this stain? Right? Well, I think calling out a white supremacy, that what you start to do by doing that is you're saying that there is an elite that's running everything, which is true, right? We all know that, and that elite is based around a race. Well, that bit's not true. And once you start to get there, you're absolutely looking in the wrong area for your solutions. The Nazis did this, you know, and they were able to go, the whole world's terrible, it's because of a Jewish supremacy. I know it sounds terrible, but we need to get rid of that, and we need to fight against it, actively fight against it. And this is what I feel is coming from the ideological left, is that somehow you need to balance the world because of these terrible things that the white people have done. I think that is false, and I think it's pretty evil. And the thing is that, of course, these types don't care if it's evil against white people, because they don't believe you can be racist against white people. They don't believe black people can be prejudiced. It's not racist. This is all the bullshit that people trot out, and I am fed up with it. I don't want to have to pretend I adhere to it, because it doesn't even make sense to me. But when it comes to siphoning off, you know, black experience in America, saying, right, this is black music, this is our black spaces, this is this, Elvis Presley appropriated it, this is the real stuff here and here. As soon as you do that, you take the power out of what you're trying to do. Okay? I think it's better for Elvis Presley to emerge, spread the word of rock and roll, because this is exactly what happened in the UK to me. When I was a kid, didn't like Elvis Presley. When I saw him, I felt there was something not quite real about it. I was after the heaviness and dirt of rock and roll. My first music form I loved when I was about 8 was rock and roll. In the UK, we had Shawaddy Waddy, and we had, like, you know, the Darts, and then we had Grease come out and Happy Days. You know, all that was something that really informed me, and I started to go look for the real deal, and I liked it. I didn't like Elvis, so I liked some of these songs we've been talking about. Then I heard Little Richard, and when I heard that voice, I felt it was the real deal. I didn't care about the colour of people, I was just looking for genius and excellence. I recognised it, you know, I recognised it in Little Richard. I recognised it in Chuck Berry. I also recognised it in Eddie Cochran. I thought Eddie Cochran was heavier. I wasn't so much keen on Buddy Holly, but I knew he was a genius. But that was something else. Everly Brothers, absolutely, but I didn't like them. I love Little Richard more than anybody else. My point is I found my way to that. Now, I don't need some idiot to turn around and go, but that person's a black person, it's a black people can be good, you see, they can be better than Elvis Presley. I don't need that, maybe because it's British and I like things done subtly and with nuance, and I can accept that, and I hate clunky ideological sledgehammers coming in and trying to bash the idea into my head. I don't need it and I don't want it, and I want to live in a country where I'm free to have that opinion. I want to live in a country where I can say, I don't really like that. I like that. I like that one, and I just want to see it as great music, right? And I want to see that all these geniuses have come in. You cannot proclaim your own worth by pointing to some genius that happens to have the same skin colour as you. This is all wrong. So Elvis Presley to me is the king of rock and roll. Why? Because he's the full package, right? He plays proper rock and roll, might not like it the most, but he does, right? He has electric guitar over the sort of swing brass section. That's another thing he does. He can dance, he can move, he's sexually provocative, he looks like a film star, and he's the best looking bloke to ever exist in popular music. All that has never been equal to anybody else. You name someone else who's got that. If you come up with anybody who's got that, whoever it is, and I will call them the king of rock and roll, whoever it is, even if they don't play rock and roll. But if you can't, shut up. Right, so I think I want to finish now by having the complete Robert Plant interview, because he really explains it here. Now, obviously, as I've said a million times on this channel, I did play for Robert Plant, and so I heard about Elvis Presley all day long. From I could see how important he was to Led Zeppelin and to Robert Plant and the whole kit and caboodle. And I use the word kit and caboodle, and I'm British. You see, we can take on these American things. No English person says kit and caboodle, but here I am thinking about Elvis Presley. I'm saying I'm assimilating it for you. So let's see what Robert's got to say. And before we do that, please like and subscribe, become a patron. Links down below, PayPal tip jar. Thanks for watching. See you on the next video.
No matter how his image has been maligned and how it ended up, when I met Elvis with Led Zeppelin one evening in LA, and I remember that night at the Forum, he was doing something like Reconsider Baby or whatever it was, the Lowell Fulson song. Yeah. And he stopped it and he said, wait a minute, we've got Led Zeppelin in here tonight, we've got to get this right. And I went, I mean, so I mopped the tears away and we got the nod that we were going to meet him afterwards. And we went to the hotel and they had the entire top floor. No motorbikes or snakes. They just had these trestle tables with a couple of big guys. And they ushered us to a suite down the hall. It was a tacky place. It was great. It was all purples and browns, and you know.
He carried that with him, I believe.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. The room was filling up with sort of second-hand Anne Margarets. There was a lot of.
Well, you know, it has to be said. A second-hand Anne Margaret is
nothing
still.
Wrong with that. I tell you. And I was looking at Stella Stevens over the other side of the room and salivating. It was a fantastic build-up. And the hall, at the end of this huge suite, which was almost as big as this room, a door kept opening and somebody kept popping their head around, just waiting for the temperature of the room and enough cosmetic to join the atmosphere, so that it was getting a bit sort of feral. And then the door opened and this guy came through the door and my heart jumped. It was like, whoa, look at the way he moves. And I mean, he was just going around chairs like... He was so cool. And I mean, of course, he wasn't supposed to be cool, but he was, you know, a bit like us, I suppose. It's like and he came over to us and we stood in a circle for about 2 or 3 hours talking, and people kept coming by from his retinue, from his entourage, thinking that he had enough. He was going, no. We had a great conversation. And our manager, Led Zeppelin manager Peter Grant, is sort of quite well known as, probably as much as John Paul Jones, you know, big guy, a very great presence about him. And Peter was just going past us on the way to taking a seat somewhere in the homage area.
The second circle.
That's right, yeah. And he lost his footing a bit like our friend there, and he 350 pounds of joy ended up on Vernon Presley's lap. And Elvis's dad was really frail, with a white safari top. And we talked with Presley for about three hours. It just went on, and then we were talking about the root, and your question about where did it come from? It came from him, and he still got it. He still was into that whole Delta thing. He, you know, good rocking tonight, all that stuff that got him going in the first place. But he also knew, and he had a great sense of humor, and he knew that he was locked in this self-parody. I mean, when the songs dried up, when Lieber and Stoller and Pomus and Schumann, when that kind of whole era of creative writing started to wane and things changed, I didn't want to hear Elvis doing a Neil Diamond song.
Right.
I wanted him, I mean, it was bad enough him coming out of the army and doing Are You Lonesome Tonight, you know. I wanted him to stay wild, to give me all those edges, that kind of, that howl that he had. But, you know, he was just amazing and spectacular, and it was just that he really opened the door to my whole love of music. And because of him, and because of the choice of his material, I found out Smiley Lewis, you know, I found all those great singers, and now all these box sets that come out, some of the stuff that he did in the 60s, and was quite so well crafted.
Yeah.
Hank Garland's guitar playing, the stuff at RCA in Nashville, I mean, the recording of it, and his humor in the middle of it all, it's great. So it was a dream come true to meet him, but it was also just by chance that I heard him, and it affected me the way it did. And from Elvis straight through to the Tuareg guys in Timbuktu, it's a straight line.
Yeah.
It curves a bit, but the blue note is there all the way through my life. It's just calling to me.